Yes, I do not recommend flying 20 hours with a 10-week-old baby. It's not a good idea. But anyway, I'm going to start with a bold prediction, and that's this, that we're actually in the nascent stages of a collaborative revolution that's going to be as big as the Industrial Revolution. If the 20th century was defined by hyperconsumption, characterized by credit, advertising, and individual ownership, I believe that the 21st century is going to be defined by collaborative consumption and characterized by reputation, community, and shared access. Over the course of the next 20 minutes, I'm going to explain how I arrived at this picture. I'm going to highlight some hot areas of collaborative consumption over the next 5 years, and as David said, really focus on the key ingredient that community-driven marketplaces must get right, which is trust between strangers. But before we look to the future, let's take a quick look back, because over the last 40 years or so, we've actually wired our world to share. And in the first phase of the sharing evolution, we used technology to exchange information, knowledge, code. Then came the rise of social networks, where we connected or reconnected with people. Now, with the increasing organization of the web and person-to-person relationships in place, we saw the third phase, where we started to share and exchange media, photos, film, music, in a way that we'd never seen before. Now, what I've seen is that at lightning speed, we've actually entered the fourth phase, where we're sharing and exchanging all kinds of assets, cars, skills, money. It's this phase that I call collaborative consumption. And it's a rising culture and economy that has the power to reinvent not just what we consume, but how we consume. Now, you can think of eBay or Craigslist like the godfathers of this idea, in the same way that they enabled anyone to become a buyer or a seller without layers of middlemen in between. Nowadays, wannabe car renters, bed and breakfast hosts, tour guides, teachers, money lenders now have a marketplace to do so. Equally important is there's an increasing cultural receptivity around sharing and collaboration. Indeed, as I say, it's becoming more hip than hippie. Now, I'm going to give you an example of where I think collaborative consumption is going. I'm going to give you an example of a brilliant startup in the United States right now. And that is called, that's called TaskRabbit. This is Leah Busky. She is the founder, and she first got the idea for TaskRabbit on a cold, wintry night in Boston in 2008, when she ran out of dog food for a 100-pound Labrador Kobe. Now, not wanting to drudge out into the snow, Leah began to wonder why there wasn't a simple platform where she could post errands and someone in the neighborhood could bid to run those errands for her. At the time, she was a programmer at IBM, and she began to toy around with how this idea of social networking would become service networking. Now, the easiest way to understand service networking is how you use your online relationships to get things done in the real world. 4 months later, she quit her job and TaskRabbit was born. Now, the way TaskRabbit works is people post errands, runners, called rabbits, of course, they bid to do the job, and then the poster selects the rabbit they want based on the price and reviews, and the errand gets completed. Now, the range of tasks varies enormously. It's everything that you might expect, from house cleaning to grocery delivery to all the way through to things like help teach my grandparents how to use an iPad. I even saw one the other day which was, can you write a love letter for me on my behalf? Now, I want you to guess what you think is the most common errand posted on TaskRabbit. So I'll just ask a few people here. What do you think is the most common errand posted on TaskRabbit? Ironing? No. Laundry? No, I can tell these are two men. Ironing, laundry, anything else?
Tomato ketchup.
Tomato ketchup? What? Tomato ketchup? Okay, next one. And gentleman here.
Groceries.
No, not groceries. I'll give you a clue. Not walking the dog. We've all been there. You know, you're sitting there and you're trying to find the right screw, and you've put it all together, and then you realize that the piece doesn't... IKEA furniture. It's incredible. 75 requests every single day for help assembling IKEA furniture. If you Google assembling IKEA furniture, TaskRabbit will actually come to the top of the list. Now, TaskRabbit has actually done $4.3 billion of transactions since it launched in 2008. Now, when you think that grocery delivery is an $83 billion sector, temporary labor, $64 billion sector, this is just in the US, moving $65 billion sector, you start to get a sense of how big TaskRabbit could become. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I actually encouraged the fund that I'm a partner in to invest in this because I saw the commercial potential. But more importantly, I fundamentally believe in the core of the idea, because what it's about is empowering people. It's about empowering everyone from stay-at-home mums to retirees to people that have been recently laid off to be able to make money or save money from their existing assets. And I call these micro-entrepreneurs. In this instance, it's time and skills which are their idle assets. Now, TaskRabbit is an ingenious idea in itself, but it also highlights how social, mobile, and location technologies are coming together and coming of age to create two fundamental principles that make collaborative consumption possible, and that is efficiency and trust. We now have an unbound marketplace to match millions of haves with millions of wants, whatever they may be. In other words, we can trade buyer to seller, borrower to lender, neighbor to neighbor, without layers of transaction costs and middlemen in between. Equally important is that technology creates the social glue for trust to form between strangers. We now live in this so-called global village where we can mimic the exchanges that actually used to take place face-to-face, but on ways and in a scale that have never been possible before. So what I think is interesting is that technology is actually taking us back to really old market behaviours. We're swapping, trading, renting, bartering, sharing, but they're being reinvented in ways that are relevant for the Facebook age. And this is what I call collaborative consumption. Now, I have a confession to make, which was I was doing my book tour this time last year, and it was really interesting because I was getting a lot of bemused looks around this idea. And I think it was pretty telling that the most common question that I was asked is this a short-term trend or a reactionary blip to the recession? I sensed that people saw this as a threat, not an opportunity. Now, just 9 months later, people are saying, how big could collaborative consumption become? What broken industries can it help reinvent? What social problems can it help solve? And that's because the technology is coming of age. So let me just give you two sectors to give you a sense of the scale, size, and possibility. So Mintel recently did a study that showed only 18% of people in the UK trust big banks. Meanwhile, there's another sector that's going through extraordinary growth, which is called social lending or person-to-person lending. This is when people lend money directly to each other. Now, Zopa, which is Europe's largest provider, went through 62% growth from 2010 to 2011. The global market for peer-to-peer loans this year alone is going to be $500 million. Now, what's interesting that always gets people is not the interest rates, is the default rates, because lending money directly to each other seems like a bit of a crazy idea. Now, if you think that credit card rates, the default rates around 8 to 10%, traditional banks is 3 to 4%, on Zopa and other social lending platforms, it's 0.9%. Now, I spent a lot of time with borrowers and lenders because I was fascinated by this, and what I found is they all talked about trust and accountability. They said, I trust you more than a big bank. And they talked about money becoming human again. Now, let's look at another sector, which is peer-to-peer travel. Now, this is undeniably one of the fastest-growing sectors of collaborative consumption. For those of you who don't know, things like One Fine Stay, CrashPad, and the biggest of them all, Airbnb, match people with spaces to rent, with people looking for unique spaces to stay and authentic travel experiences. Everything from castles in Scotland, to beach huts in Thailand, to cool lofts in Manhattan, to igloos, I kid you not, to you can rent this island in Fiji for $500 a night, are all being rented out peer-to-peer. Now, Airbnb increased in number of nights booked 1,200% since this time last year. Airbnb have done over 2 million reservations to date. They've become the 30th company, 30th venture-backed company in history to receive a $1 billion valuation. Now, that might seem inflated, but when you consider the vacation rental market alone is an $80 billion sector, and that's only one segment they're playing in because there's all kinds of space rental, that number starts to make a lot of sense. Now, I was speaking to the Airbnb guys, and I was saying, like, how can we give people a sense of the scale of this thing? And we came up with two great stats. The first is there's enough British people using Airbnb to fill the O2 Arena twice. But this one is incredible. All these pink squares are Airbnb rooms from last week. More people tonight will stay in Airbnb accommodation in New York than in a hotel. So there's been a lot of interest in the profit and sharing by venture capitalists and media, and this is fantastic because this is going to take these ideas into the mainstream. But my passion, and why I spent the last few years helping entrepreneurs, trying to create a common brand and understanding around collaborative consumption, is because I've seen how it's connecting with people at a deep values level. There's this widespread fatigue in faceless transactions and anonymous mass-produced goods and empty consumer promises. But the flip side of that is that we are seeing a resurgence in the belief in the importance of community, both in the virtual and real worlds. I actually think that farmers markets and Facebook have a lot in common with each other because they're feeding our social self, the side of us that seeks connection and belonging. Now, in the same way that we want more farmers markets and corner shops versus supermarket chains, and we want to buy beautiful gifts from real craftsmen on Etsy, we want to lend money, real money, to real people. We want to stay in real homes with real people. In the world of collaborative consumption, people are investing in meaning. They're investing in industries becoming human again. So now to the future. Now I've given you a context of what it is. And I'm going to highlight what I think are 4 hot areas for collaborative consumption over the next 5 years. The first, or as people put it to me, what is the next Airbnb? The first is access over ownership. Now, access over ownership actually has 2 drivers behind it. And the first is relationship to stuff, a changing relationship to our stuff. And the second is an awareness around frequency of use. Now, Kevin Kelly actually gets credit for first using access over ownership. He wrote a brilliant blog post about 3 years ago where he talked about our possessions dematerializing into the cloud. Now, the fact is that our relationship to stuff is far less material than any previous generation. I don't want the DVD, I want the movie it carries. I don't want the CD, I want the music it plays. I don't want an A to Z, I want directions from A to Z. In other words, we're a generation that doesn't want stuff. We want the needs or experiences it fulfills. Now, the second driver to access over ownership is this notion of what I call idling capacity. And this is the untapped social, economic, and environmental value of underused or underutilized assets. That's everything from the car that sits idle 22 hours a day, to the evening dress that we wear once and never wear again, to rooms in this hotel that are sitting empty. All these things have idling capacity. Now, what we're starting to see happen is innovative service models where we figure out that people actually want to pay for the benefit or usage of a product without needing to own it outright. Now, one of the sectors where this is really taking hold is cars. I'm not going to talk about Zipcar, but I want to look at the evolution of one sector. What's happened over the last 50 or 60 years is we've gone from outright ownership to the entry of first-generation rental models, so things like Avis and Hertz, to around 10 years ago where we saw business-to-consumer car sharing, so the likes of Zipcar and Streetcar. Then, around 3 years ago, smart entrepreneurs realized that the expense in the business-consumer model was the cars themselves. And there's all these cars that sit idle for 22 hours a day. Why not give people a way to monetize them? So they introduced peer-to-peer car sharing. Now, what I think is telling is that in the last 18 months, BMW, Ford, Peugeot, Volkswagen, and just last week, have all entered, GM just last week, have all entered the car-sharing sector. In the same way that smart newspaper companies are realizing that their business is no longer defined by the second word paper, but the first word news, car companies are realizing they're no longer in the business of ownership, they're in the business of mobility services. Now, it was really interesting to look at the press around Ford and Zipcar's announcement. They recently partnered. And Bill Ford said, we shouldn't be threatened by this. We should embrace this as an opportunity. In other words, like the music and publishing sector, they have a choice. They can reinvent themselves or protect themselves. They can disrupt or be disrupted. Now, the second big hot area of collaborative consumption to watch is what I call collaborative lifestyles. Now, it's not just physical stuff that can be shared in exchange. It's less tangible assets like time, spaces, skills, and money. TaskRabbit, Airbnb, Zopa, Kickstarter, co-working spaces, these are all examples of collaborative lifestyles. Now, I'm often asked, what's my favorite example of collaborative consumption? And that's a bit like picking your favorite child. But I have to say, I'm most passionate about this category. And the reason why is it's tied to an important realization of what technology can't replace, but what it can enable. And that's that's meaningful human relationships. Technology can't replace, but it can enable meaningful human relationships. And what we see in collaborative lifestyles is people using the internet to get off the internet, to have real-world physical experiences. That's what's happening in TaskRabbit. That's what's happening in Airbnb. The third area to watch is enabling technologies. Now, these are technologies that are going to make sharing and collaboration sort of like the 3 C's. You know, give them convenience, choice, and then the cool factor. So the first of those is payment systems, right? It's got to be easy to pay one another. And what the likes of Bumper Square are going to do is going to reduce the friction costs in peer-to-peer payments. The second is keyless systems that are actually going to make it more secure to access other people's stuff. That's the partnership between GM and Relay Rise in the US. They've actually partnered with their OnStar systems to improve keyless systems around their cell phones. And the third, which I think is going to be really exciting in 2.12, is what I call embedded intelligence. These are things like QR codes and augmented reality that we can embed to stuff to make it smart, social, and shareable. So let's go back to where I started, because this is the fourth area, and it's really the biggest but most grey area of collaborative consumption, and that is trust between strangers. Now, every idea needs a poster child, and Airbnb has become the poster child for collaborative consumption. But it also highlights the challenges and opportunities of marketplaces built on trust. Now, it's really funny. I met the Airbnb guys in 2008, and they were living and working in this tiny apartment in San Francisco, and I kid you not, they were selling Obama O cereals and Captain McCain's, actually, it was the time of the election, to pay their bills. This is a dead true story. Now, anyone who's met Brian, Joe, and Nate will tell you that these guys are extremely passionate, and they saw how big peer-to-peer space rental could become, that it was going to become bigger than eBay. The problem was that people and investors didn't get it. And the big question was, would people trust one another to rent out or share their space? Fast forward to 2011. I love the difference in the two photos. This is them now in their offices with their recent investment. And what's amazing actually about this graph is I made this in February. Since then, there's been an additional 1 million reservations, so 2 million reservations to date. Now, the incredible thing is that in those 2 million reservations, there has only been 2 serious incidents of theft and vandalism. Now, the media loves these, right? So we think this is happening all the time. Now, these incidences are undeniably, absolutely atrocious for the individuals involved, but they actually spark a much-needed debate and innovation around this area of trust between strangers. I think that this whole notion of connecting trustworthy strangers, creating the right tools and systems, is a totally untapped market. What are the different dimensions of trust that should be measured? How do we ensure our digital identities reflect our real-world identities? How can we create online tools that create positive offline experiences? I think it's so interesting that I'm actually going to dedicate much of next year to looking into this area and maybe write a book on it, because it's just so grand but so big and wonderful. And one of the areas that I'm looking at is the idea of reputation capital. Now, my working definition is that reputation capital is the measure or value of a person's reputation across different communities and marketplaces. This isn't your social media profile, this is something different. Because what's starting to happen is that as people transact on Zopa, as they transact on TaskRabbit, as they transact on Airbnb, they are leaving a reputation trail of how well they can and can't be trusted. So what I'm interested in is, can the different dimensions of trust, generosity, reliability, consistency, can they be tracked and aggregated? Now, this is really complicated, right? But if we can do it, it's going to be amazing. It'll be like the ancient powers of word of mouth meets the modern network world. Now, I think that reputation capital is going to become a cornerstone of the 21st century economy. I think it's going to become a currency that's more valuable and important than our credit history. So, just as a way to wrap up, I want to go back to the picture that we started with. As David said, I had a baby boy a few weeks ago, and I think, as most first-time parents will tell you, it puts a lot of things into perspective. And during the many sleepless nights when the rest of the world feels like they're asleep and you are awake, I've had time to really think about the type of world that I want him to grow up in. And I think we'd all agree that the left-hand side of this picture is broken. It's really one gigantic Ponzi scheme that's left us environmentally, economically, and socially vulnerable and empty. And when I see the right-hand side of this picture, the reason why I'm so passionate about collaborative consumption is because I see possibility, I see innovation, and I see a return to deep human values. Now, on the plane over, I was trying to think of my favorite quote about the future. And it's without a doubt by a Danish philosopher called Søren Kierkegaard. And he wisely once said that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. I believe that we'll look back and see this period as a collaborative revolution, a turning point when we use technology to reinvent entire sectors, leapfrog over broken consumer models, and found a healthier balance between the needs of individuals, the needs of companies, and the greater good of society. Thank you very much.